Anyway, we welcome you. We're excited that you are here with us this evening for our second Global Read webinar series, sponsored by the Africana Book Award. The Global Read webinar series, this is our second annual series this spring. Once a month, we hold a webinar sponsored by an area book award. There's a website. There's a website called Internationalizing Social Studies that you can go to see the calendar of all the upcoming events. If you have any questions, I see Rosa can hear us now, but just notice that on the bottom there is a chat box, and if you start chatting, start typing, you can see some messages on the right-hand side. What we're going to do is hold off on questions until the end, and I just want to let you know that if you have any trouble hearing us, there is a phone number. I sent out a link to the phone number. You could call in if you're having issues with your internet and listen in or ask a question with us then. So I'd like to, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the chair of the Africana Book Award and founder of the Africana Book Award, Brenda Randolph.
Good evening, and welcome to, as Denise said, the second of the Read Across Cultures webinars, the second of 2019. Again, I'm Brenda Randolph, the Outreach Director at the Center for African Studies at Howard University and the Chair of the Children's Africana Book Awards Committee. CABA was founded in 1991, and that's what CABA is, what our abbreviation for the Children's Africana Book Award. It was the first of the Area Studies Book Awards, and more than 95 books have been recognized. If you'd like some information about CABA, recent and past CABA winners, it's available at cababooks.org. We are also pleased to have as a moderator tonight Mobile Ntetwa, who is a researcher at the Zen Education Project, and she's also a member of the CABA 2019 committee. We're very happy to have her here with us. We are so pleased tonight to have 2018 CABA winner Arushi Raina with us to talk about her debut novel, When Morning Comes. Arushi was born in Delhi, India, and grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is the setting for When Morning Comes. She has lived in lots of places: Egypt, Nigeria, the US, and most recently in Canada. She began When Morning Comes when she was a student at Vassar College. And now let's meet Arushi.
Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I am calling in from Vancouver, Canada, and yeah, it's great to come together on a virtual platform, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions. So please do keep them coming, and I'm sure we'll deal with them at the end. So for this session, I really want to frame some of the key questions and thoughts that I've had after taking this book not only to Canada and the US, but South Africa, and most recently India, and the type of questions I get from teens and some of the lessons learned from different teachers who have started piloting and teaching this book. So again, very, very open to any questions and feedback. We're always learning. And I'm just excited to talk a little bit about the book with passionate people such as yourselves. So I'm going to share my screen and walk you through our piece here. So you should see a screen pop up here. Does everyone see the screen? Okay, great. So, the title of this webinar is really Apartheid South Africa, Youth, Resistance, and Fiction, which is a mouthful, but the world we live in today is a mouthful. And and as educators and teachers and people in the community, I think it's so important to think about what it means for youth. So one of the most powerful things that I've found shopping this book around or talking in schools in this book is using history as a vehicle to talk about the complexities and challenges of today, and the power that this book has, even though it's not set in this present, to explore that. I'm going to talk through a little bit around my background just very briefly, so you know who you're talking to and kind of what the book is about. Talking a little bit around the history of apartheid South Africa, and I know I've got a very educated panel here who I'm sure have a different perspective. I'm just going to provide a very simple, bare bones structure with which to navigate and draw some parallels. And then I really want to go into, you know, some of the key themes of this book and different ideas and thoughts around how to workshop and share this book, not only for English, but also for social studies as well. And I've had examples from between grade 9 and 12. So it's actually quite a broad spectrum of learners who engaged with this material. So I start with Nelson Mandela because, you know, for those who are not, you know, from South Africa, you know, sometimes Nelson Mandela is maybe the one person, you know, besides maybe Trevor Noah now, who they can connote to, okay, this person's from South Africa. And, you know, Nelson Mandela is really the backdrop of how we, you know, try and engage with this idea of resistance, sacrifice, and peaceful, nonviolent resistance. And as students engage with this material, sometimes starting with Nelson Mandela is a good grounding because I've at least heard his name. More deeply, though, you know, I think what's important to realize is, you know, Nelson Mandela is really a symbol for a larger resistance movement in South Africa. And this story occurs in the time when Nelson Mandela was in prison, which is why you have this image here. It really occurred when, you know, him and other senior leaders of the resistance movement were taken out, either out of the country, either killed or jailed. And what happens when you lose leadership? And that's really what my book is grounded in, that history in the 70s, when that gap, that leadership vacuum was occurring in the country. You know, the way I frame it to students is, you know, Nelson Mandela is in jail. So what do you do if you have, you know, issues with the government? Who do you turn to get to your answers? And really the answer is leading to youth. Youth actually design their own solutions. And that's why it's so powerful to bring this book into schools, is that it's not really, you know, like World War II literature where you have some teens inserted into the mix. This book and the Soweto uprising, which I'll talk about, was designed and led by youth. The main characters, by their very nature, have to be youth. There's no artificial insertion in this case. And that's powerful and that's important. And I really emphasize that because sometimes it's lost in the story, the power of youth and the agency of youth, independent of quote unquote grown-ups. So a little bit about me. As Brenda introduced me, I've traveled quite a bit. I grew up in Johannesburg during the late 90s, so the Truth Reconciliation Commission really up to kind of the early 2000s. You know, what's interesting is sometimes I get reactions is I don't look, you know, I'm not Zulu, I'm not Xhosa, and I think, you know, one thing to say is that there's such a large Indian South African community, of which I'm not a part, but one is that South Africa is quite interesting because you actually have a lot of racial migration from as early as the 18th century coming in. So you have people who look very different coming from these places. And when I was in South Africa, it was interesting because I was always called Indian, but my identity wasn't questioned because in South Africa, there are a lot of quote unquote South African Indians. And it's an interesting way to view history because, you know, I always think about how my race has textured how I write and what I write. And as well as growing up in Johannesburg. And one of my character's lines, you know, she says, being Indian is confusing. You know, you have uncertain loyalties. You know, the police can't tell what your loyalties are. And I think to some extent it's true and it's not true, but it's definitely shaped how I am as a writer, somewhat of an outsider in some racial dynamics and sometimes very much in the mix. In addition to South Africa, as Brenda mentioned, I've really lived kind of around the African continent for quite a while, living in Egypt and Nigeria as well. And you know, for me, the reason, you know, why this book is so near and dear to my heart is that I'm not writing I'm not writing a book meant for children. I'm writing the text as I best think it can be written, given we're talking about a youth uprising in the 70s. So you know, the discrepancy of taking content and dumbing it down is really not something I believe in. I really believe that youth is, especially today, but you know, in all parts of the world, are exposed to such complexity and challenges, and there's no need to dumb things down. And if anything, is to provide a context for difficult conversations to happen. And I think that, you know, historical fiction has this way of making history breathe. So the first time I shared this class, this book, and it was in manuscript format, was in Vancouver, Canada, and you have a group of quite wealthy young people who have never even set foot in the continent of Africa, don't know anything about South Africa, and you have this one teen boy sitting in the corner there, and you know, we're not sure if he's engaging or not, and then you know, the teacher turns to me at the end and says, you know, your book is the first he read in the whole class I've done with them. And in the question and answer period, he puts his hand up and says, well, why don't they teach this in class? Why are we learning this boring stuff? Why aren't they teaching this book in class? This is so much more interesting. And I know I'm convincing, I'm preaching to the converted, but I think that's why I really feel this book is really in social studies and in English. And it really does, you know, stick to some of the main events of the Soweto uprising and explores apartheid, but in a way that is, you know, really using the story to its advantage. And that's really the kind of way I wanted to engage with historical texts when I was young. So that's really where it's coming from. The last theme I wanted to talk about, which is important to me, you know, we talk about cultural appropriation, we talk about, you know, whose real story it is. And, you know, I grapple with those questions every day, and every day when I think about this book and any book I'm writing. And I think, you know, part of my reality and part of what I'm really believe as a writer is to step carefully. And what I mean by that is, you know, questions of whether you're telling the right story in the right way are present with you right till the end of the manuscript. No one is exempt from these questions, least of all myself. I think, you know, for me, the text is emerging, and I'm always looking for corrections and dialogue and openness to evolve the text. For me, lastly, I think it's growing up in South Africa is the impetus for writing this book, and using primary accounts. And I think that has forced me to actually be quite scared when I first wrote this book, because I was aware of the complexity and what I was delving into. I'm grateful that I gave it a shot, and I had such support from, you know, your awarding agency, but just many, you know, the community around the world, and even, you know, some great communities in South Africa as well. So wanted to talk a little bit of, you know, before we get into apartheid, what really happened in South Africa. And apologies for those of you who are already all over it. But very quickly, I mean, South Africa, as many places in the world, you know, started as a trade post, and really, you know, saw some early settlers coming in from Europe, and using, you know, South Africa more as a trade post, not with long-term settlement. And a number of things, including the discovery of gold as well as the climate, really suddenly propelled huge settler colonies, and really the question of colonization. And so what you had in South Africa was not only, you know, this, you know, racial colonization, but infighting between different powers, which crystallized into the British form of colonization and the Boer form, which is really the descendants of the Dutch who'd come and settled in South Africa in early years. And so it's really important when we look at South African history is understanding that the backbone of some of the tensions is actually the tension between the British and the Boer. And, you know, one of the reasons why we had, you know, the advent of apartheid and the way it was articulated was the need for the Dutch or the Boer population to articulate their identity distinct of the British, and to declare agency distinct of the British, but also create a structure where they gave the British some implicit power, so they created some level of harmony. I think, you know, what's, you know, you'll see in the text in the book, I use a variety of words. Some are very much Afrikaans, which is what the Boer you know, descendants spoke. Language actually got a complex origin, but Afrikaans is really some of the words sprinkled in. You've got some Xhosa and Zulu as well, which really become almost normal parlance in South Africa where you speak English and a mixture of these other words. But what you saw in the early 1900s was really the rise of the National Party, and really the formalization of racial institutions that were already there, but really institutionalizing and creating a structure around them in a way that was bizarre. I mean, one of the things when I was in school in South Africa, when, 97, 98 South Africa, when they try to explain apartheid to me, they always started with a pencil test. And I think it's a powerful one to talk to kids about if they don't know about it, was in some cases to understand if someone was colored, black or white, the racial institutions at that time would actually stick a pencil through your hair. And if the pencil fell through the hair, you were either Indian or white. If it didn't, you were either colored or black. And it just shows there's a sort of ridiculousness of racial classification in a powerful way for young people, because sometimes they, grapple with, okay, what is apartheid? Well, sometimes these simple examples are very, very helpful. The development of apartheid, as a system, it was researched, it was architected. That's what we always say about South African apartheid. It was architected. And really we had, some of our leaders some of the leaders of the National Party coming to Canada and studied the residential school model, pull models from other areas of the world to really create this master plan of how to subjugate a people. So what we found in sort of the latest stage of apartheid, I'm skipping several decades here, is, prior to the 60s, you did have a movement of nonviolent resistance, both from, parties that are now the ANC, a number of other parties, including the PAC, including, the Indian liberation movement that Gandhi started, also really seeded this idea of nonviolent resistance. What you had in the 60s and 70s was really some forces coming to a crux, and this was, sort of correlated with a move, especially within the ANC, but otherwise, of not only, Black consciousness, but this understanding that nonviolent resistance was not getting the results it needed to get. And Nelson Mandela was really the architect for bringing some of the more militant resistance under the banner of Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is called, roughly translated as a spear of the nation. But there was also a number of flashpoints before, in the 60s with the Sharpeville massacre, which I'm sure you've heard of, which was a number of folks actually peacefully protesting and was shot down by the South African police force. So when you had this intensification of violence that really came into the 60s and 70s, you really had a pressure cooker. Added to this was, really looking at the vacuum that I talked about, was with increased incarceration and exiling of political leaders, you also had a gap. And the gap really came, as I mentioned, with youth. But to understand why youth were really, the core of this movement, was to understand what was happening in the 60s and 70s around the legislation around schools. So what I'm going to do is just walk you through a little bit, before I jump into that, some pictures shot by Ernest Cole, kind of roughly between the 60s and 70s, that really encapsulate some of the images and sort of themes in the country at that time. So that's Ernest Cole. I hope you can all see him, who's a photographer. There's some wonderful photographers from that time. I'm just gonna click here. Just gonna clean up this. Okay, great. So Ernest Cole there. I'm just going to read the captions and just let you kind of absorb the material here. Boy in school. A boy clutches a chalkboard in overheated and unfurnished classroom in Ernest Cole's image. Boys playing. Child and nanny. Quote, I love this child, though she'll never grow up to treat me she'll grow up to treat me just like her mother does. a maid quoted by Ernest Cole in his caption for this picture. This relationship.
Arushi, I'm
Yeah.
not sure. I'm not seeing it. I don't know if other people are, but I can't. I'm not seeing Ernest Cole's.
Okay, let me do that. Does that help?
Now, yes.
Okay, great. So let me just start from the beginning. So boy in school is this image. This is called Boys Playing. And I'll read this caption again. Child and nanny. I love this child, though she'll grow up to treat me just like her mother does. A maid quoted by Ernest Cole in his caption for this picture. And this relationship of a working woman, you know, separated from her own family because she's not allowed to live among white people, to serve a white family and really grow to be and sometimes the interim mother, but sometimes really the present mother for this white family's child. And the complexity of this relationship is something that really seeped into my book because it's so central to where the political becomes personal in apartheid. And it's a theme that echoes itself over and over in a very powerful way in the history of South Africa, but even in the current state of South Africa, where it may not necessarily be racial, but because of the structure of income inequality, you have, you know, working mothers and fathers very much separated from their families and serving another family as a helper and a nanny, and the complex dynamics of that relationship. I don't know what happened there. Handcuffed men, Black South Africans upon their arrest for being in a white area illegally. So this was a big component of apartheid, as you would imagine. It was formalized through the Group Areas Act and the Pass Laws Act. And what it really did was really contained people according to the race to specific areas. And if you were a Black young boy or woman or an adult, and you either had forgotten your pass or you didn't have a pass or you were just coming downtown or coming to the white areas and you were found, you would be taken to jail. No trial, no questions asked. And this idea that you had to have a license to be in a specific area of your own city is something that is, you know, it really kind of, it encapsulates some of the restrictions on freedom. And as I was writing this book, you know, I knew about the pass laws, obviously, but as I was writing it, I realized because some of my characters cross town, and each time I had to think about their passbook, even when they were just going to go and meet someone, going to go and, you know, go and work with their mom. The logic of needing their passbook, having the logic that a white person had to sign their passbook to give them authority to be in the white area, was so interesting even to write through, because it became a way that the plot constricted itself and tightened in itself. You know, not only, and I think a case of where fiction really echoed reality. Mine recruition. Ernest Cole took this picture of gold mine recruits who had been lined up in a grimy room for a group examination after sneaking his camera into the mine inside his lunch bag. So, you know, this picture, obviously so disturbing and just dehumanizing, but I do go through this series of pictures with youth because, you know, they react to these images. It becomes real to them. And again, I think 16-year-olds are living this reality that we're trying to, not all of us, but some of us want to protect them from. You know, as you probably know, the mine system was really what broke the family structure in South Africa and had lasting repercussions. And really the origins of apartheid was in how, you know, the capitalist machine was trying to rationalize Black labor and get Black labor for mines. And there's a lot of thinking in South Africa around how the mining system actually precipitated apartheid in many interesting ways. Police swoop. A police officer detains a boy who must show his pass in central Johannesburg. Many of Mr. Cole's prints were rediscovered in Sweden in 2006. So, you know, this dynamic, as I was talking about, of even youth needing their ID to be in a city, or being taken away if they were found without the ID, without their parents knowing, and just being taken and then disappearing from anywhere where any one of their friends knew, was very common. You know, the other day I was talking to a South African lady. She was about 36, and she talked about her cousin who was never found in the 70s, a young boy who just disappeared overnight. So this history of not accounting for Black lives is not new, obviously. It just manifests itself in different ways in different places. Riverside. So, you know, this picture is really captures a very rare moment. And it's around, you know, interracial communities, and which there were very few during apartheid, as you would imagine, and most of them were relocated, shut down, and closed off. But Sophiatown and Riverside were two examples of racial interaction and coexistence, and you know, people interacting as close to equals as they could be. As you know, in apartheid, you know, the Immorality Act banned any type of relationship across races. And my book, as it explores the relationships, kind of touches on some of the barriers that law imposed and the pettiness of that law. So I'm starting back at the school image here, because, you know, what happened in schools in the 70s was not only did you have all these conditions and some of the conditions I outlined, but you also had a situation where, you know, a lot of these students were learning the learning school in English with supplementary secondary languages, of which were their own. And in sort of 76, without very much preparation at all, the apartheid government rolled out a policy to enforce Afrikaans for all students in the school, barring, I think, grade 12s, overnight with no infrastructure. And they said, you take Afrikaans and you have to learn all your subjects, math, you know, geometry, geography, all in Afrikaans. And this really was the seed that, you know, or the light, that the match that was struck that really precipitated the movement of the Soweto uprising. The idea that this was just enforced on these schools with no consideration of the conditions is important, as well as the fact that Afrikaans at that time, because of the ruling party, was so heavily nationalistic and Afrikaans oriented, it was a sign of oppression, more so than English. So those are some of the dynamics that really precipitated this movement from the students. So I'm going to go back to the presentation now. So how did these students deal with this? You know, how did they, given what was happening, how did they come to be here, 20,000 students on the street? To understand that, you know, I really went into a lot of primary counts, which are thankfully available. And the origins of this were really cells in different schools, which often guised as debate societies or student executives, really decided to come together and say, we're going to mobilize against this. And the ingenuity of these cells in each of these schools, communicating in a world without social media, in a world without email, in a world without phones, because a lot of these folks were in the township without phones, and in a reality where they weren't able to gather in public, otherwise they would be disbanded, is mind-boggling. And it still inspires me, is how did these cells of students organize so effectively, given all their barriers? And a lot of these organizers were 17, most of them were 16 or 17, and do so that on the day of June 16th, you had 20,000 students, schools from all parts of the township coming together in orchestrated, organized proceeding as they walk up to Orlando Stadium to protest against the BAS law, the Bantu Education Act, to peacefully protest and articulate their key demands. And that's a question, and it's a question I pose to students, because I don't know if we know all the answers. I can give you some easy answers, but it's just incredible and inspiring to me how that happened. You know, as they're walking up to the Orlando Stadium, in their minds, as far as primary accounts tell us, is they're going to, as I said, articulate their demands of the government. In large cases, in most cases, their parents and teachers, and last of all, the police, don't know what's coming. They have no idea that 20,000 students are coming on the street that day. And that is what leads to this confrontation of police, a small number of police, untrained, against a group of youth protesting. And as is echoed in our history, in our current state, is when, you know, these authoritarian powers, untrained, and especially the police force, is confronting something that they're not equipped for. It precipitates an act, a single act of violence that triggers unimaginable loss. And that's really, you know, the backbone or the climax of the story, is that moment when that one person decided to shoot, and what that means for our history today. You know, you had numbers and numbers of unmarked graves of young children being shot at because of that one shot. And again, you know, I think it's so present today in our history that I'm always thoughtful how I bring this up as this topic. But I think it's also powerful for youth to understand that this is not an isolated trend. This is part of the way in which the world has worked, and there needs to be a change, and that youth is the vehicle. You, or the youth, are the vehicle for change. That single shot, there were two sort of first shots. We believe the second shot was on Hector Peterson, who, you know, his death really became the symbol for this uprising, and this photograph was somehow smuggled out of the country. I think had, you know, a number of journalists post this and really alerted the international media with heightened awareness of what the apartheid government was capable of doing. Hastings Ndlovu was 15. Hector was also, I believe, 15. That's his sister next to him, running beside him. She currently actually is helps to facilitate individuals through the Apartheid Museum. But this picture really, if you're growing up in South Africa, it's a very iconic picture for you. It recalls a lot of images for you. It's not a neutral picture. It's not just any picture. It is the picture of the Soweto uprising. There's also a monument to Hector Peterson in Soweto that I've often been to. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and in the last couple minutes here, and then leave the floor open to questions, is talk a little bit around, you know, the inspirations and the characters, because, you know, I've given you a backbone of the history, but really the way I approach the story with students is really getting into the characters, the motivations, the personalities. A lot of the school teachers who have taken on this book really have a bunch of students doing exercise around trying to try the different voices, try to role play specific scenes from the book across those different characters, because really the book operates on the mechanics of characters coming across each other, coming from such different realities. So the inspiration of this book was really Zanele. She popped into my head as I think I was in South Africa, visiting South Africa, and I was just looking down on the floor and I saw a jazz singer, and then this character came into my head, and she was a jazz singer, but she wasn't very good at singing, and I just had her fully formed personality, but I didn't know where to fit her. So, you know, I'd like to say I was really smart and knew I wanted to set a book in Soweto uprising, but that's not how it works. It's always a character you fall in love with. And in this case it was Zanele, who was, a student. You know, she's a student activist by day, accidentally so, and by night she sings at the Shebeen very badly. And, I think someone asked me this, and it's true that there is a role of female protest too in everything that we talk about. If you look at these are real pictures from the time. You have young women coming on the street and being core to the organizing of this movement. And I think in retrospect, this book is really homage to that, of young women, taking the stage and being part of the leadership and agency for change. Talbo is really, a character I really am very, very fond of, as much as he's morally sort of in the gray. And he's a Tsotsi, which at that time was, seen as a street gangster, but it's really a loose term. And a lot of Tsotsis at that time had quit school because school wasn't serving their purposes. And, had varying fashion styles, but depending on their unique subculture of what Tsotsi, what gang they were involved in. And in some ways, romanticized view of this kind of robbing rich people to serve their own communities, in some cases less so, robbing whoever will give them something. And so Thabo is a young man, 17, who's quit school, and he's a Tsotsi. But, what I try to do in the book is really play with that identity and play with who he is behind this mask and his fancy outfits. Mina is South African Indian, so she grows up in between the white and black areas of town, running a shop. A lot of Indians were stereotyped as running shops at that time. So again, I play with that stereotype and also play with what it means to come from the Indian community, not fully, again, not being Indian, having some things you carry from the Indian community, but really being South African and invested in the country in a very unique way. And lastly, Jack, grows up in the white areas of town. And when I was writing Jack, someone asked me, which characters, remind you most of yourself, or which character is based on you? And they always think it's Mina. And I say, actually, no. Mina was actually one of the hardest to write because you can assume things because someone looks like you that their reality is the same as you. So you can make even a bigger mistake. But I think I often say this is that Jack was, in many ways, some passages I wrote for Jack were very autobiographical. And the reason I say that is because sometimes when I was in the areas that were historically white, there was this strange kind of protective bubble that your wealth afforded you, that sometimes blocked away the pressing reality of the country. And a lot of the voice that I pull from Jack is me kind of reflecting on that. And that's why maybe the voice works, maybe it doesn't. I'll leave it for you to kind of decide. Some of the key themes here, and then I'll really open it for discussion here. So, what's really powerful, and this happens almost without me trying, is drawing parallels with some of the moments in this book with the reality that we're facing now in terms of Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, maybe going a bit earlier, parallels with the civil rights movement. One thing that I think is a really powerful exercise is some of these kids going back and asking their grandparents what it was like growing up in the civil rights movement across racial lines. Because what I find interesting in this book is different perceptions of the truth through these four characters are continuously battling against each other. And that's my love affair with South Africa, is I don't think there's one truth. I think the realities and the perceptions are continuously fighting against each other, and it's okay. I would say the contrast of living in the US for me has been that in the US, because you have a majority in terms of race and a history, those voices are not so apparently lifted up and fighting against each other. So any way to bring that forward in your fiction, but also in research projects where, you're forced to interview or ask people who don't look like you, what is it like to be who they are, very much echoes with the themes of this book. This book is very much just 4 points of view running kind of rogue on this. I explore at, again, different difficulty levels, the impact of different points of view in fictional narrative. That's a fancy word, but what I really say in the book sometimes with grade 8s and 9s is, what about the way in which Zanele tells a story and the way she acts and her history shapes who she is and her interactions with Jack and Thabo, and really getting kind of a sense of the readers getting comfortable with the instability. I think a lot of literature sometimes dumbs it down and says, okay, no multiple points of view, one point of view and one reality. No, that's not how reality works. There's multiple layers. There's no such stability. And especially in high school, it's important to grapple with these pieces. Apartheid, I think a lot of these students, again, it varies where you are, but often I've gone into different US schools and Canadian schools, and sometimes there's not an awareness of what apartheid is. And I think there's so much, online literature available that it becomes a really good research project to, preface to do some research on the apartheid system on your own, and then read the first 3 chapters of the book or read the whole book and pull out how the Group Areas Act or how the PASS Law or how the Bound to Education Act becomes real for these characters in the book. I think then you have to map the emotions of the character with the reality of the system. Relationship between settings and character. So a lot of these characters are set in their own settings. You know, Raina and her shop, Zanele and the township, you know, the shebeen, but then also her shack, Jack and his Houghton home. And these realities become really clear ways to demarcate almost identities. So how do those interact with the character? Again, you know, a simpler way of saying it is what does Jack's surroundings tell you about his character, for example? And these are just some ideas. Some resources that actually have already been developed. So there's actually a historical note at the back of the book. So a lot of teachers actually miss it. It's actually there to give you a really, you know, brief overview of what the historical context was. In addition, there's a study guide that is attached to, I think, the webinar, and it's on the website, that has a lot of comprehensive questions with an English/social studies lens that you can pull from. Feel free to use it and not use it. A lot of teachers have used it in South Africa and a few other areas. And so that's available to you. If you're having trouble accessing it, I'm sure the organizers can share a link or to that. A number of additional resources. There's history, South African history online, which is pretty good. Project Gutenberg. It's a compilation of a narrative and pictures from that time put together by Helen Polan McCormick. It's freely available. It's extensive. It's worth clicking through. Fiction, Mandela by Miriam Tlali. So Miriam Tlali wrote the book right, you know, a few years after the uprising, trying to tell this story. And I think it's a good precursor. It's told much more in documentary style, but it's a bit precursor if you really want to get into the Soweto uprising and really fictionalizing the Soweto uprising. And, you know, as we're moving, we see a lot of, you know, music, like, you know, almost having a playlist to accompany the book. And because a lot of this book happens in Shebeen, some of the, you know, musicians that I would say encourage, you know, if the students are interested in a multimedia experience, I put the wrong name there, but Miriam Makeba, Tanji Klassen, and Hugh Masakela not only sang songs and covers that were very iconic in the period, but a lot of resistance songs that are very, very iconic going forward. You know, if there's any details from an author perspective, my website is arushiraina.com. I'm also kind of on Twitter, but my website has a bunch of interviews. I've had an interview also with in South Africa, and more recently the Jaipur Lit Fest. So if, you know, if there's any resources there that are helpful to understand motivation and context, that's all available as well. So I've added some bibliography, but yeah, that's kind of all from me in terms of that me talking component, and I'm really looking forward to hearing any questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much, Arushi. So I'll be moderating the question portion, so if people have questions, they can put it into the chat and then I will read it out. But before we start, I just want to ask one question of my own. Can you talk a little bit about the character development and sort of interaction and attitudes between Jack and Zanele? Like, how did you come up with that relationship and how they interact with each other?
Sure. So not to spoil the book too much, but the beginning of the book is quite shocking because I have an incident where, you know, Jack, as a prank, puts on blackface and ends up in the shebeen. And it was a very challenging choice. And through all editorial reviews, I stuck with it because I think we need to be honest about some of the polarization and just the difference of perspective that comes with racial, even at a young age, that you're so racially influenced. So it really begins with a very, horrifying encounter of Jack in blackface with a very angry Zanele who is ready to chases him out of the township. And the reason I start there is because you have a South Africa that's ready to explode. And the reason it's ready to explode is precisely this complete incomprehension of the reality of what you're doing, or even, indifference. And I start there because I think that's where the story starts. And how do you even work from that moment? And I think what I do there is I play a little bit, and I put, you'll see how, surprisingly, they have these chance encounters that start spinning out of control, which force, each of them to encounter other people's humanity. but also encounter their own, especially Jack's own visible and invisible prejudice. And what's interesting about Jack as a character, and I was very conscious of doing this, is that he's not going out there trying to be a good guy. His personal emotions get caught up in a net that forces him to rethink who he is. And I think until racial difference becomes personal, until it becomes personal for you, you can be whoever you want to be. And I think that's where the book really starts, and early interactions with all the characters. But between them, it's really that piece. The other day, one of my publishers actually posted my book on that for a Valentine's Day passage and took an interaction between them. And that's the first time that's happened, because, a lot of the book is not really always about love. It's about the opposite. And, it was funny when they took a passage, and that passage is them calling each other out for their nonsense, but also in a humorous way, which is actually very South African too, which I didn't see in the US when I was studying in the US, where even now, and there's a lot of issues in South Africa, there is also as racial humor where you call out people for what they've done, and there's a moment where you can choose to engage, laugh, and learn. And that's still a moment in interactions and humor in South Africa. It's not always the case.
Great, thank you so much. I'll start with this first question here from Lasego.